center stage was the fate of the Iran nuclear agreement. With us to discuss this, we have our senior national affairs correspondent, Owen Alterman, and Professor Uzi Rabi, director of the Moshe Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University. Uzi, President Macron trying to preserve the Iran deal by basically making it what he calls the first, one of four pillars, the other pillars being perhaps some kind of new agreement that covers the ballistic missile program of Iran, its other activities in the region, and its long-term nuclear activities, the sunset deal. Even if President Trump agrees to that approach, is that going to fly with the other parties in the region, especially Iran?
Well, I think that Iran would find it very difficult to digest, actually, those four conditions or whatever that Macron actually put forth. Let me just say something about what we have seen here, because I think that this is kind of, it could be developed into kind of a watershed or a kind of a breakthrough in what we have had in the Middle East recently. This is the first time when the West is speaking in a different tone when it comes to Iran. What I get from Iran inside, when it comes even to the Revolutionary Guards and even some of the politicians, in my opinion, there is kind of a certain amount of anxiety because Trump is not being taken anymore as the leader of the free world. He is dealing with the Middle East in a different, totally different method. He is unexpected and unreasonable, and they are pretty afraid of his, I would say, grip, iron grip or whatever. Now, what is very, very important is to see Trump and Macron together. Now we can talk a little bit about the byproduct of this attack that used to be in Syria. Britain, France, US, this was kind of a prelude to something that we do see here now. This is the first time that a wedge, or to drive a wedge in the 5+1 thing. It was until now America versus the others. I think that France actually is joining the United States. And remember, until recently, Syria told us that the Middle East is being run by Persians, Turks, Russians. Well, there is kind of an opportunity
well, I want to pause here
to come to the fore.
I want to bring into the conversation also from Washington, Jarrett Blanc. He's a senior fellow of geoeconomics and strategy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He's also the former deputy lead coordinator and State Department coordinator for Iran nuclear implementation, someone who knows a thing or two about how this process could work. Jarrett, great to have you with us. Let's start with a little bit of the basics, which is Trump saying this deal should never have happened without including a regional solution, meaning reining in Iran, in Yemen, in Syria, elsewhere. And that seems to be part of what Macron is calling a new deal. Do you think that is the right way to go? Is it reasonable?
Well, no, it's utter nonsense. Saying that taking on the hardest and most important challenge, Iran's nuclear challenge, and solving only that without solving the other admitted problems that we have with Iran's policy is insufficient is just another way of saying don't even try diplomacy. There's no example in history of two states with as many problems as the United States and Iran clearing the decks with one automatic, comprehensive deal. The Obama administration solved the hardest problem. That creates a platform for addressing the other problems. Suggesting tearing that deal up and going back to a situation of nuclear ambiguity in Iran, it's madness. I'd also just say that I did not hear the press conference in any way the same way that your previous guest did. I did not hear President Macron suggesting that he's aligned himself with President Trump on this Iran issue. I hear President Macron continuing to reach and to struggle and to try to find a way to keep President Trump engaged in the JCPOA and to allow the Western alliance to then deal with the other issues. I did not hear him suggesting that he was prepared to tear up the deal and accept permanent enmity with Iran.
So he's just trying to buy time?
My impression is that there is a sincere effort underway to get some coordination between the U.S. and the three main European countries to have some agreement in advance about what they would do if Iran crossed certain hypothetical policy lines in the future. I think President Macron and his fellow leaders in Europe would be more than happy to accept a deal like that. I think it's something more than buying time, but it's something much short of really renegotiating a comprehensive solution to the problems of the Middle East.
Owen, Jarrett, and Uzi, different views on what they just saw and heard in Washington. I want to get your viewpoint.
Well, you're going to hear a third completely different viewpoint, Calev. Look, for the better part of a year, we've been talking about a policy that's fix it or nix it. We now have an entirely different policy, courtesy of Emmanuel Macron, mix it. This isn't fixing the nuclear deal. This isn't what we just heard from our guest in Washington, putting down conditions unilaterally by the U.S. and the Europeans to Iran about what they need to do. This isn't nixing the deal. This isn't canceling it. This is mixing the deal with the bigger regional issue. What I heard from Emmanuel Macron is an offer of a deal to Iran. On the one hand, Iran, you accept, you agree to these fixes, quote unquote, to the JCPOA, to the Iran nuclear deal, including a deal on ballistic missiles, including extending those sunset provisions indefinitely. But on the other hand, Iran, we're willing to give you concessions. In the regional arena, we won't let you be a hegemon. The other regional powers, which, by the way, when Emmanuel Macron says it includes this country, will be at the table. But what I heard between the lines is Iran will still have a regional role. And I'm not sure, Calev, that people in Jerusalem are going to be all that thrilled with that. For example, one of the items that might be agreed on is that Iran is allowed to have bases in Syria. Syria's sovereignty is protected, as per Emmanuel Macron, and Iran can't be a hegemon there, but Iran can still have bases there, and that's going to be agreed to potentially. I mean, we're looking far down the road by all of the great powers and by the regional powers. I think there are a lot of question marks here. This is a very new direction for this nuclear issue, and I agree with everyone that it looks like Donald Trump will sign that waiver on May 12th to give time for these negotiations to happen, but I'm not sure that people in this country are going to be so thrilled when the dust clears with the direction in which this is going.
Your very brief take, should Israel be happy with what we just heard?
Yes, sure. And again, the Americans know if they're going to pull out from the region, there would be a regional war. If they would like actually to bring in relative stability, this is once again must be said. Saudis, Kurds, Sunnis, Jordanians. This is the strip that would cut the Iranian actually crescent from one side to the other.
And Saudi Arabia, presumably that very rich country, or one of them that President Trump was referring to, saying they need to pay more, but exactly. More for what? We're not quite sure.
We're still discussing that press conference that we just heard at the White House with President Trump and French President Emmanuel Macron. At center stage certainly was Iran. Let's listen to a bit of what President Trump had to say.
But I will say, if Iran threatens us in any way, they will pay a price like few countries have ever paid.
Well, with us in the studio still is Uzi Rabin, head of the Moshe Dayan Center at the Tel Aviv University. But let's go back to Washington and speak with Jarrett Blanc, Senior Fellow of Geoeconomics and Strategy at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Jarrett, obviously some disagreement in the studio here. Do you think the Trump administration is ready to make some kind of pivot on its role in the Middle East and get more involved to a degree that seems to go against a lot of what President Trump has had to say during his campaign and certainly during his first year plus in office?
Well, I think that there's clearly a struggle within the Trump administration about where their priorities should lie. President Trump wants to diminish U.S. involvement in the region. He has an isolationist view of our role. There are a lot of hawks in the administration who are still looking for a larger, more militaristic presence for the United States in the region. I don't have a guess as to how President Trump in the end is going to resolve the dispute between himself and his advisors. One thing that I will say is that I think that some of the discussion that you're hearing about Syria reveals a little bit the incoherence of President Trump's own thoughts on Iran. On the one hand, he thinks that the nuclear deal is a terrible deal. He thinks Iran's fingerprints are all over all of these problems. But on the other hand, he's not looking for a long-term U.S. investment in Syria. So on some of the key areas where Iran is trying to exert its influence, he doesn't look to be the counterbalance.
Uzi, what do you think about what you just heard, particularly on Trump's policy in Syria?
Well, I tend to agree with what was said before, but I have to say there is a pressure coming from different parts of the Middle East. It's not only Israel, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Egypt, Jordan. I guess all these states have kind of a coherent and very authentic view about what is the problem in this region. And the problem is named Iran.
But what are they doing about it? What should they do about it?
What should they do? I mean, there is kind of a common denominator. What they should do is to persuade the Americans not to totally pull out from the region. Now, I accept the hesitations and the disagreements within the Trump administration. But Trump himself said, we are not going to pay for that. The Saudis are going to pay for that, or somebody else. What we are going to do, if there are states to come together and create once again kind of a preemptive force by which to cut Iranian influence and to be supported by some Europeans and Americans, this by itself would create kind of a belt by which to say to Iran, enough is enough.
Jarrett, do you think that maybe that's what Trump had in mind, some kind of pan-Arab force that would be funded and perhaps guarded by Americans but doesn't involve U.S. boots on the ground?
Well, you know, if that's what he has in mind in Syria, he's years too late. The Arab proxies in the Syrian conflict have the Gulf proxies don't seem to be the critical players at this point. So that it's not a terribly logical perspective from my view. Obviously, the Trump administration, Trump himself, has got some kind of an idea of an axis that includes Israel and some of the Gulf countries. Again, to go back to the nuclear deal with Iran, I think the one way that you could kill the current rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia would be to encourage some sort of nuclear race in the Gulf that speeds up Saudi efforts to build up a civil and potentially military nuclear program. I mean, that will drive a wedge between Israeli and Saudi interests in Washington that would be very, very difficult to bridge.
Jarrett.
So I don't see a coherent policy.
Jarrett Blanc in Washington.